2 out of 3 teens are leaving the church once they leave home. Really?
Yes, and this is confirmed by numerous surveys and polls.
Why are youth leaving the church in such large numbers?
The number one reason is science, and they're taught an evolutionary history of the world, which contradicts the Bible's history. It's not maybe or perhaps our children are going to be taught evolution in the school system and in universities tomorrow. They will be taught that. So therefore, evolution and creation, we should be addressing it before they encounter this. The reality is, today we have more evidence to support biblical creation than at any time in the church's history.
2 out of 3 teens are leaving the church. This is an alarming statistic. Why are they leaving? And is teaching creation the solution? Gary, you are an apologist of over 30 years. You've been working in that area. You've authored 9 books. You've had some award-winning documentaries, producing and writing and directing them. You've ministered in over 1,500 churches. You have spoken to tens of thousands of Christians. You've really just done the whole thing. Given your vast first-hand experience, would you say that these statistics are true, or is there something else at play here?
Sadly, they are true. I wish I could say something different. And, I knew that question was going to come up, so I have brought some stats with me, and I just want to read out a few stats. They might be a little dry, but I think it's important to show that these are surveys over a wide-ranging denominations and over many years. So, for example, the renowned Barna Christian Research Group. So they're a Christian research group, been operating for many years. Pastors often use their stats in surveys, etc. So they've consistently found that 60 to 70% of teens walk away from the church after they've left home. It's amazing that these figures, in some respects, are seemingly ignored because, as I said, pastors use their figures. But on this particular issue, we never see these numbers raised in any sermons, etc. It's more ministries like ourselves that are trying to raise awareness. Yeah. Lifeway research in the US showed 66% of 18 to 22-year-olds stopped attending church. The Southern Baptist Convention, the largest evangelical denomination in the United States, their own surveys, they had the figure at 88%. Okay?
Wow.
The US Assemblies of God reported similar figures, 66%. Now, some might say, and I've got some more stats I can read out later, they might say that, some of these figures are old, but what it's showing is that the figures have been consistent over a long period of time. And it's also consistent with what myself and other speakers, like in creation ministries, in all of our offices over the world, find out. When we go to churches and mention some of these statistics, invariably people come up to us, parents come up and say, that was my son, that was my daughter. So that's what we've seen firsthand as well.
So given that there are a wide variety of churches and you're just one person, Gary, what makes you believe that the statistics might even be higher than anticipated, like up to about 88%?
Well, as I mentioned, it's firsthand experience. So when I go to a church, often, or what I started doing in recent years, once we really tried to create awareness and make a difference, I would often go in, and I'm in a church for the first time, and I'm kind of doing, the basic Creation 101 talk, I'd often start off and ask the congregation, so when you've been out witnessing to your friends, do your children or grandchildren come home, and do you get questions, even if you're just talking about the Lord Jesus, invariably do people come back with questions like, well, yeah, if the Bible's true, tell me who Cain married, if we started with Adam and Eve. Or if the Bible's true, why can't I see dinosaurs mentioned in there? What about the races? Why does a God of love allow bad things to happen in the world? And then here's what I do, James. I ask the audience that if you've ever received or heard questions like that from your friends or family, just put your hands in the air for me. Just hold them up. And without exaggeration, and I know actually a lot of the other speakers within CMI are adopting this approach as well, I would say between 80 to 90% every time of people raise their hands. So then I'm making the point that shows you that these questions, which are science-based, are intellectual stumbling blocks to people believing in the truth claims of the Bible. So I try to show that's a first-hand demonstration that these are the issues that are confronting people in believing in God and God's word. So yes, our ministry, we estimate we've got offices in 7 countries. We probably do over 1,000 presentations a year. And we've been doing this, the ministry's existed for over 50 years.
Yeah.
So when I said it's wide-ranging, over a long period of time, we go to every denomination that will have us. So this is our first-hand experience as well, and it just confirms what these polls and statistics show. But here's the thing I found even after that is that the process of, if you call it the loss of faith in our teens, starts before they leave home. Barna did another confidential research denominationally wide, and it asked the children in the church confidentially, and it actually revealed that 2 out of 3 of them had already made their mind up they were going to leave the church
already
once
66%.
they left home. So 2 out of 3 of our kids sitting in the pews in Christian homes, in Christian families, had already made their mind up they were going to leave. But here's the thing. Why don't parents realize that? Why doesn't the church leaders realize that? And it's because so much, I think, is grounded around activities, particularly for our youth in church. So mum and dad see their children can't wait to get off to the youth group on Friday or Saturday night and they have fun. That's a social activity. But it's not addressing the real issues and the questions they're going to face when they leave home.
Yes, yes. And so with that, do you think that being a hard truth for a lot of parents to sort of think about and understand that there are like lots of examples of maybe the parents don't think that stat's going to apply to their family?
Like I said, I think they see their children active in the church and in church programs. And let me give you an example. So when I went to the US to help start the Office for Creation Ministries there, we're based in Atlanta. Atlanta's one of the largest cities in America, and in the Southeast, it's regarded as what they call being in the Bible Belt. So it's a very conservative area. And that's why I'm kind of mentioning this, because if this happens in an area where there's a strong church culture, how much more in countries like Australia or the UK or New Zealand or South Africa or Canada, where there's less of this conservative Christian culture. So one example, I remember being in a small rural church in South Carolina. And during my presentation, I was getting lots of amens and, yes, brother, and so I thought, the message is being received really well. And at CMI, we often take our materials, our books, to make available so people can use them for teaching their families. And there was very, very little take-up of the resources. So there was this disconnect. I'm getting all these amens, people agreed, but they're not seeing it as an issue that they need to be involved in. So I remember one older lady came up to me and she said, Mr. Bates, she greeted me very warmly, 2 hands, and said, oh, that was fantastic. It was just a wonderful meeting. We just agree with you. And I thought, well, I'm going to challenge her. And I said, well, ma'am, I said, if you think it's an important issue and you agree, I said, these resources are here for you and your family. I said, do you have some children or some grandchildren you think could benefit from this? And she said, I'll never forget it, she says, oh, you don't understand, Mr. Bates. And just as she said that, she says, look, and there was her grandson being brought out of the Sunday school by her daughter. She said, see little, and I can't remember his name, little Johnny over there. He's 5th generation of our family in the church. That's what she said, his 5th generation, as if there's some generational inheritance to faith. But what it shows is there's more of a cultural aspect that's going on in places like that. And so I just thought, sadly, little Johnny could be, one of those poor statistics, 2 out of 3 leaving the church. And we generally found that to be the case. So we were getting this disconnect. We were going to these churches, lots of positive feedback. People were agreeing with the creation message that, God created in 6 days, etc. But they didn't see the need to address this in their own homes, in their own families, without realizing what their children are going to get by the time they leave home,
No, that is rather alarming, because that can really just happen to any family from what we can see with the stats. No one's really exempt from the statistic really coming in and sweeping through their family. So we have this problem. We have teens leaving the church at a rate of 2 out of 3. That's a huge amount of people leaving, 66%. What do you think is the major reason for this exodus from the church?
Well, I don't want to come across as arrogant and a know-all, but I have been in ministry for over 30 years. As you mentioned, ministered a lot of churches. And I'm just one of Creation Ministry speakers, but what I'm going to share is their same experience as well. And as I said, in every country, we know what the problem is. And this is actually shown in some more stats, which I want to read out. So, for example, in Australia, Barna Research did a study, 2019, and the youth replied that science was the number one obstacle between 18 and 35-year-olds. That they listed that as number one, an incompatibility to what they saw as science, in quote marks, and the Bible. In the US, it ranked as number 2 on the list. Another report cited, this was 2017, it was interesting, some stats it pulled out. This is while kids were still in the church giving this survey, remember, James. They disagreed with the church's teachings about God. That was 15% of them.
Right.
10% of them said they stopped believing in God altogether while they were in church. So if this means 15% that felt that the way God was presented to them did not match with the reality or what they believed about him, 10% came straight out and said they didn't believe in him any longer. So they became atheists while they were in the church. Now, I'm not trying to, I hate it when people kind of say, the problem with the church is and criticize it. We're here to help the church. But clearly what they're being taught from the Bible is not lining up with what these kids are seeing or experiencing out there in the world. Yeah. And that's exemplified, of course, once they're on their own and they're in universities or going on to higher education or just generally out in the workforce. So when you think about it, what we see on TV every day, what we hear in the media, what our kids learn in school every day is we are bombarded with this idea that there was a big bang 13.7 billion years ago and a process of evolution on the earth has taken place over hundreds of millions of years. That's how we got here. And if they're taught that as, the facts of science, what are they hearing in church? I would suggest they're hearing in church about the creation story, that they're just Bible stories. Well, Jonah and the great fish and Noah's flood, they're just Bible stories, but they don't line up with reality. And that's where the disconnect happens. And it's such a shame because we actually have so much evidence today to actually support the premise of biblical creation. So rather than just teaching a Bible story, wouldn't it be great if the pastors and the parents said, this is what the Bible says. And by the way, here's some evidence to support that particular viewpoint. Here's some evidence to support the Bible's history. Yeah. And, when it comes to things like archaeology, which is an area that I specialize in as well, oh my goodness, there is so much there to support the Bible's history. But that's not taught. So, and this might be controversial when I say, we shouldn't teach our kids to say, well, just believe the Bible or just believe. Because I've met so many people who said, well, I was just taught not to question, just believe. But they go out into a world that's, allegedly teaching some sort of, rational point of view and saying, well, what you believe has to be backed up by evidence. And so I believe that if we could teach what the Bible says, plus back it up with some real world evidence, we'd be much better off. And being taught to critically think is what is taught in schools and what we aim to teach our kids, because we don't want them to be swayed by all sorts of different teachings if they don't critically think. And if we think to tell them to just believe the Bible at face value and not really dig into it, that would sort of be undermining this idea of critically thinking for yourself and how this could work. Yeah. And it's not like there's no statistics or any kind of data that doesn't back up what the Bible says. Yeah. So it would actually be academically integral for students and people who are Christians to actually go looking for that kind of evidence. Yep. You won't get any objections from me on that.
So yes, so we have a problem. And, a lot of churches might not have identified that this might be a cause, that being taught creation as sort of a fairy tale might be the cause of this problem, this disconnect, this disbelief. What have you actually done to sort of combat this?
Well, I just read out some stats, and actually that's just a handful. There's lots and lots of more, but I think when we look at the stats, they're kind of dry, and we kind of say, well, that must be somebody else's children. So I got the idea of just going on to university campuses in the United States, around Atlanta. And by the way, just so for some perspective, for people who are not from the US, We estimate there were more evangelical churches in Atlanta than, say, in the whole of a country like Australia.
Wow.
I used to drive to work 13 miles in the morning. I would pass 17 churches on my way to work every morning. So
no shortage of them, for sure.
Exactly. So going into an area where there's a church culture, we went into universities in Atlanta, and we did a video survey. And I thought, if these young people themselves, out of their own lips, if their parents, if families could see this, where children are saying, yeah, I was raised in the church, but I'm no longer there, and what their reasons for, that would be better than someone coming in saying, well, here's what the statistics said.
Yeah.
So what I did is I brought we made a small 30-minute documentary about this.
Yeah.
And I brought a trailer along today, which I'm going to ask the producer up there to show in a minute.
Yeah.
And for the first time ever, by the way, James, I'm going to make this available for viewers of this podcast, and we'll give some details at the end of that. So maybe the guys could play this now for us. I'd appreciate it.
66 to 88% of young people are leaving the church never to return. And you will see a direct correlation with those who've remained in the faith and those who've left the church.
Creation or evolution, which do you believe?
I'd probably have to say evolution.
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 Is there any powerful argument that makes you think evolution is true that causes that confusion?
I think the studies that have been done on apes and monkeys are pretty compelling.
I think that the genetic sequence can change over time, over millions and billions of years.
Mostly fossil records and just databases of really just the fossil records.
In your church background, were you ever exposed to any scientific evidence for creation by your church leaders, pastors, anything like that?
Definitely not.
Nothing in particular, no.
No, I don't believe so.
Do you still attend church today or not anymore?
Only for holidays.
We kind of stopped going together as a family, but...
You see, there's one worldview that every single person in this country has been exposed to. The idea that evolution is true and that the Bible's account of origins is nothing more than fairy stories. When we demonstrate to believers that the evidence strongly supports the historical account of the Bible, not only is their faith ignited, but they become excited about sharing the Bible's truth with family, friends, neighbours, and even co-workers. Did your church leaders, student leaders, bring in any creation teaching that showed you there was scientific evidence to support the Bible's account of creation?
Yes.
Yeah, we learned a lot about different creationist scientists and the proof of young earth creationism.
What are you studying now?
Biology.
Biology, right. Steeped in evolution. So, but you're not convinced by the evolutionary arguments in your biology classes?
No.
Still attend church today?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Yeah, every Sunday.
Would it be fair to say then that being able to discuss creation openly at church has helped strengthen you in that area, prepare you for what you've learned here at college about evolution?
Yes.
So I should have mentioned too, I said we're making that available for the first time because it's been available for years. In fact, that's probably one of the most popular videos we've ever produced, and tens of thousands of them have been taken up by families and churches to try to create awareness. But what I should have said is we're making it available for free for the very first time, and you're going to provide details, I believe, at the end of this. But let me encapsulate for people. That was just a trailer, so that's just a snapshot. We asked 4 questions. And as we stood there, as students came past, the first question was, were you raised in the church or not? And if they said no, we let them move on. So we had hundreds of kids there. And if they said they were raised in the church, the next question we just said, creation or evolution, what's true? And out of the hundreds of students we surveyed, James, only 5 said they still believed in biblical creation.
Goodness.
5. So the next question to the ones that said they now believed in evolution and the ones that said they still believed in creation, we said, when you were in the church, did your pastors, parents, leaders, anybody show you the wealth of information we have to support biblical creation today? And I want to make a point that all of those students that now believed in evolution, every single one of them said they'd never been shown any evidence, any information. But that handful, that 5, there was only 5 that said they still believed, they had been shown information.
Right.
Now, it's not like they had all the answers. In some cases, they said, well, we had a creation group to our church, but that means that they knew there were answers available. There was a resource they could go to. But here's the kicker. The very last question was, do you still attend church?
Right.
And all those people that were raised in the church had said they now believed in evolution, except for one young man. And we put him in there to show that we were kind of not stacking the deck, no longer attended church. And the 5 that said they still believed, every one of them said they still attended church regularly on Sunday.
Wow.
And again, I don't mean it in any big-headed sense, but when I went out, the reason I did this survey, I knew exactly what we were going to get. It just confirms what I hear, read, not only in those surveys, but in our own experiences out in churches.
Well. So I suppose there's always going to be people skeptical that your sample size wasn't large enough, or you were a bit more selective about who you showed or didn't show on screen. What would you have to say to that?
Well, the first thing, I would hope that as myself being a Christian, working for a Christian organisation, they would believe that we would be honest with the data. But secondly, all polls are done on a sample size. And we did get some emails that, how many people did you survey? Well, the thing is, I've learned that if I said it was 100 or 500, 1,000, it doesn't matter. Somebody's going to say, well, it wasn't large enough. But as I said earlier, it only confirmed our own experience, and it confirms what other surveys are showing. So, ours is not an isolated example.
So obviously these students working and studying at the university are being bombarded with this idea of evolution. Was there anything in particular in the idea of evolution that really had these people convinced that creation wasn't the answer?
It's a good question. We just saw on the trailer there, I actually asked, was there any particular evidence that made you believe evolution was true? There were 3 main areas that came up all the time. First one was human-chimp DNA similarity, and the figures have often been quoted at 98%. Those figures are out of date, but the percentage is not the point anyway. I mean, if there's a common creator, you'd expect common design similarities anyway. And one of the protagonists of that original survey, his name was Dr. John Alquist. We featured him in our Creation magazine. He actually became a creationist and has stepped aside and kind of really no longer even supports his own original survey. There's lots more. There's arguments that they were not comparing the same parts of the genome. Only a handful of chimpanzee genes were surveyed when there's over 20,000 in human beings, etc. But it was a surprise to hear the students parroting, if you like, repeating that same percentage when it's out of date. The other one was genetics. A guy said the genetic sequence can change over billions of years. Well, humans and animals have not been around for billions of years. So that's one. And modern studies are showing that the genomes of humans and every animal are actually decaying. We're mutating. Mutations are building up. They're actually causing degradation in the genome. And particularly with human beings, I mean, they believe that Homo sapiens have been around for, now it's up to 300,000 years. Well, in that time, if we look at the current decay rates, we kind of should be almost mutated out of existence. So, in fact, the study of genetics is actually a creationist stronghold, I believe, today. It's an argument to defy the idea that time plus mutations can give rise to, new organisms or new information. But the number one answer I got, and you saw on there, was the rocks. The fossils, the rocks and the fossils. They're talking about the geologic column.
Yeah.
And this is his idea of all of this rock strata, hundreds of meters or thousands of meters around the world, that was laid down slowly and gradually over millions or even billions of years. And we look at the fossils in them, and then they believe that's a record of biological evolution on the earth over that time. But the Bible has another explanation.
Right, yeah.
Noah's flood.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I would say to some of the students, for example, and I know that I say, look, I know you don't believe it, but just bear with me. There could be another explanation. The Bible talks about a global flood, right? Now, if there really was a global flood, I want you to imagine this, the original supercontinent breaking apart, devastation upon the earth, billions of creatures being killed and buried. We kind of got to the point to say, well, what would you expect the evidence to be? And grudgingly, they'd say, well, yeah, you'd expect probably thousands of meters of sedimentary layers with dead things in them. And I'd say, well, actually, that's what we find.
Yeah.
Right? And it's a shame because although that was the number one answer, I think as creationists, that's the easiest thing for us to answer. Because if all of those rock layers were laid down in the 12 months of Noah's flood, all right, then there's no millions of years. And if there's no millions of years, there's actually no time for evolution to happen. And that brings me to another point, because some other groups have also done surveys, but they focused more on kind of the issues. They said, well, here people said natural selection or genetics, etc. But all of those other aspects all need deep time and millions of years to happen from an evolutionary perspective. But if you wash away the millions of years with Noah's flood, right, wash away those rock layers that they believe were laid down slowly and gradually over eons of time, then all of those other subjects go away as well. And so in churches, although a lot of churches are happy to talk about creation, they don't want to talk about the time aspect. They don't want to talk about, oh, do we have to get hung up on a young earth, thousands, not billions? But actually by addressing that, and this is why creationists are pretty dogmatic about the age of the earth, is because if we understand that the millions of years are washed away by Noah's flood, everything else goes away with it. It's such an important issue. And so I was able to have conversations with those students, like I explained, showing there's another example, you know, another way of looking at the geologic column. But in those conversations, something surprised me. And that was, although these students were kind of repeating what they'd learnt in the class, when we started to dive in, I actually found they didn't know much about it. So education really is a kind of about, when we say learning stuff, it's remembering stuff and being able to repeat it in an exam paper. But actually understanding the very concepts they were talking about, I was actually quite shocked that they really didn't know much about it at all.
Hope you're enjoying the interview so far. We'll jump back in shortly, but real quick, imagine bringing this life-changing message to your church or community. This is exactly what we do. We present close to 1,000 events each year. So many people struggle with how science and the Bible fit together, and it is becoming a genuine stumbling block to their faith. But our speakers present satisfying answers that really make sense. We've received hundreds, possibly thousands of testimonies from people who have had their lives changed through our speaking ministry. If you'd like that for your congregation or community, then use the link in the description and contact us today. So Gary, some people will think that, you know, although evolution is something that kids bombarded with, it's not actually the reason they've walked away from the church. How would you address this sort of idea?
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I just want to make a point for people watching. I'm not saying, we're not saying it is the only reason, because there's lots of reasons. I mean, those surveys, people throw up different reasons. I think one of the main reasons that parents will identify is getting into wrong relationships, for example.
Right.
You know, making friends that kind of lead them astray, and then people might choose another lifestyle, etc. However, clearly the number one academic reason always raised is that they no longer believe the Bible. And the rot starts in Genesis, the very, very first book. If I can't believe that God created in 6 24-hour days, well, science has shown that to be wrong. Science shows, for example, you know, miracles can't happen, they might say, and therefore men don't rise from the dead.
Right.
Right? Science shows that. And so therefore, if men don't rise from the dead, Jesus Christ was not crucified and resurrected. And it's like a cancer. That's how it starts. Those doubts start. And a lot of people you talk to, they say, well, I hung on, and they try to compartmentalize their faith.
Yeah.
So, you know, oh yes, 9 to 5 out in the work week, I deal with the real world, and then I go off to church on Sunday, but they're in two separate areas. But ultimately it doesn't work, as I said earlier. You know, if the Bible is God's word, it should connect with what we see in God's world. It should connect to reality, and it does.
Yes.
It absolutely does. If we're taught and shown where to look and how to look for the information. But here's an important thing I want to mention, James. And, you know, when I kind of said I go to churches and I ask those questions, often at the end of my talks, I'll say to people, look, tomorrow, presuming I'm preaching on a Sunday, tomorrow it's not maybe or perhaps your children are going to be taught evolution in the classroom. They are going to be taught evolution in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
So if we know this in advance, if we actually know that this is the reason they're giving this disconnect between faith and science, as they call it, if we know that they're going to get information that contradicts the Bible's history, goodness, why aren't we doing something about it in advance? Preparing them. Hey, listen, when you go to school, this is what you're going to hear, etc. And try to prepare them for that situation.
And I think, do you think there's an issue at all that maybe obviously kids are getting shown more and more earlier and earlier this idea of evolution, and they're kind of exposed to it even when they're not even really sure what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
In a more, I guess.
I
guess my question is how would you approach that if there are kids, who are maybe age 5 and 6 and, their teacher just offhandedly mentions this evolution in the classroom? How would you sort of go about preparing them for that, even at such a young age?
Well, let me give another example, because quite often, when I'm out preaching at a church, might get asked to do the children's Sunday school, or there might be a school associated with the church and they ask us to come and talk to the children. So let's say I've got elementary age kids, or primary age kids, we'd say in Australia, and I'll do a talk on dinosaurs. And during the talk, I'll ask for a little question of the kids, and I say, how many kids here believed dinosaurs lived and died out millions of years ago? And even in Christian schools, they would raise their hands and say yes. How many people think they lived and died out thousands of years ago? And I might be lucky to get 1 or 2 hands. So already at that age, they're reading books, seeing cartoons, watching documentaries of mum and dad at the age of dinosaurs from an evolutionary perspective, living millions and millions of years ago. And it goes on through higher education. So I'll give you an example. My daughter, my youngest daughter, she went to school here in Brisbane, where we're recording today. And at university, she studied biology, and she came home one day and she said, Dad, you never believe what happened in class today. Her very, very first biology class, the lecturer, first thing he said was, would all the Christian students please identify yourself? Now, she didn't raise her hand. She's my daughter, but she said a handful of kids raised their hands. And he turned around to them and said, you might want to rethink doing this class because it's going to destroy your faith. And the feedback I've had, from students in Christian families where I go, they say there are atheist groups on campus and they look for the new intake and they're particularly targeting the Christian kids. And they've already got the questions lined up and saying, how would you answer this? Well, science has shown this, so what does that mean for, your belief about God creating, etc.? And the kids don't have any answers. So what does that do? They retreat into their shell.
Yeah.
And in some ways that retreat actually is part of the issue, I believe, with the church. Because when I talked about the church teaching Bible stories or lessons from the Bible, even the parents and the pastors were also bombarded with that evolutionary teaching. And so in some respects, they're also not aware that there's information that is out there to help them. And that's why a ministry, like CMI exists. But I try to, I don't know what's the word here. When I said earlier that a lot of people look at those dry statistics and they don't think it applies to their kids. So sometimes when I'm with a congregation, I've done the talk and I say, look, maybe your church is better than most. Maybe your church, tries to address this problem somehow, and you don't think your kids are going to leave. So, instead of 88%, what if it's only 50%? Is that an acceptable number to you? What if it's only 20% of your children? Because those statistics, they're 88% of somebody's children.
Yeah.
And those surveys have been done over different denominational groups. So we know that it's not just a national problem, but a global problem. I mean, James, this is so serious. People hear this and, we're dismissive. I would just beg people, don't be dismissive of this issue. Because as I said, it's been going on for so many years across different countries, across different denominations. And this will happen to the majority of our children in the church unless you do something about it. So I'm a great believer this might be cliche, but I really am a great believer in that evangelism starts at home.
Mm-hmm.
So with my children, I would say things like, around the dinner table, I'd say, hey, if you're at school tomorrow, what if somebody asked you a question like, well, I think dinosaurs lived millions of years ago. How would you address that?
Yeah.
And so what we have to remember is sometimes when our kids are in the church, even though we think they're enthusiastically following the faith, sometimes they're borrowing our faith.
Yes.
And I've written an article about this on creation.com, are your children borrowing your faith? So how do we gauge what our children believe? Well, you can't find out what somebody believes unless you ask questions.
Yes, yeah.
And so ask questions of your own children. Find out where they're at in their faith. What do they believe and why do they believe what they believe? And you'll quickly find out what level they're at. And then you've got something to address and work with.
Yeah, definitely. So you clearly mentioned also, just sort of harking back to the fallout, you clearly mentioned that this is an ongoing issue. Do you think this survey has actually made a difference, though, with people hearing these statistics and it being a bit more real? Yeah,
it has. I mentioned how I talk to the church and say, maybe it's, your percentage might be lower, etc. But it does, provide a wake-up call. When we go out to churches and we say, look, here are the percentages and this is going to be your children unless you do something about it, I noticed an immediate difference in the response. I mentioned before about after that church and, I was sitting around the book tables and no one was interested. It's not like that. And so besides the material that groups like Creation Ministries have available, our ministry specializes in actually going to churches to create awareness.
Yeah.
Because the issue is most people, as we saw in the survey, don't know, never heard creation information. So it's not just the students, it's the parents, the leaders of the church. But by going to the church, right? So we typically want to go out and speak on a Sunday morning service. The presentations are very engaging. We're creating awareness of this problem, but we're also saying, here's the solution. And as we saw that handful of students, some of them just knew that there was a place to go when they had a question. It wasn't trying to give them all the answers at the same time. So definitely, and that's why I've been involved in this ministry for over 30 years.
Yeah.
Because one, I see it fulfills a need, dire need in the church. But secondly, it makes a difference.
Yes, yeah.
And, and I'll give you an example, James. When I lived in the States for nearly 15 years and, people over there, they love the Australian accent. I'd be flying out to go and do ministry on a weekend. And this is not exaggeration. This would just happen so often. And the flight attendant would come down and say, can I get you a drink? And I'd say, yeah, I'll have a Diet Coke or something. And somebody sit next to me and say, where are you from? They hear the accent. I said, well, I'm originally from Australia. And what are you doing over here? Well, I work for Creation Ministries International. My very, very first trip to the US, I'll never forget, I was sat next to this gentleman. He kind of asked me that. And he said, what do they do? And I said, well, we believe in biblical creation. And he said, well, science has disproved the Bible. He said, how can you believe that? I found out later during the conversation, because it was a 5-hour flight, and I said to him, have you got time? I can show you some stuff. And I pulled my laptop down. And I'll never forget, he was a laser weapons scientist for the US government.
Oh, wow.
Right? And I was showing him this stuff, and he just kept coming out. He said, is that true? I've never seen that before. I've never heard that before. There you go. He'd never heard it before. And we just had this just ongoing long conversation the whole time. But that's what happens. People hear my accent. What are you doing over here? What do they believe? And I would just start sharing information. And invariably, never heard it before.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of sort of evidence in fossil records and stuff like that even I hadn't heard before. I mean, I was raised in a Christian household. I had sort of this borrowing my parents' faith thing. And then my dad actually showed me a whole bunch of this stuff. And he was like, check how cool this is. Check out this fossil. This fossil is giving birth as it's been fossilized.
Yeah.
And I'd say, how can that happen over millions of years? It would have given birth. This is so weird. Something would have happened here. That's would have needed to be buried very quickly.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, this is evidence that I don't think I would have ever seen in a textbook from school or uni or anything of that sort.
Or not the explanation behind it. So you talked about critical thinking. So you have just realized for yourself by looking at that the slow process of permineralization or fossilization could not be occurring in that circumstance. It had to be something rapid and catastrophic that buried it. And of course, what's the answer? Noah's flood.
Noah's flood.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, we've talked about how, this is an ongoing issue. 66% or even more are leaving the church in youth. Droves are just leaving. What do you recommend? What can we do?
Well, I said evangelism starts at home. So I think what we tend to do is parents and families, we kind of leave it biblical education, Christian education to the church, or if they go to a Christian school. But as I said, on this issue, we need to start at home. Proverbs 22:6, that famous passage says, train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. My children, 4 adult children, are still following in the faith. It doesn't mean that during their teen years they had a couple of, wanderlust years. But here's the issue. They're always faced with this. Either evolution is true, and there is no God, no creator to be accountable to, or the Bible's history is true, and there is a God and he is creator. I taught them, and they know that evolution is not the answer. So what does that leave?
Leaves one.
So ultimately, there's a God who created me, and he's seeing me, and he's watching me, and I've got to be accountable to him. So this issue is the rubber meets the road issue. There's either a creator or there's not. And so I think, in our secular societies, that's why, one of the reasons evolution is pushed so much. No one wants there to be a God to be accountable to. I mean, ultimately sin is the issue. So it reminds me, in 1 Peter 3:15, it says, always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you. And of course, to do this with gentleness and respect. Now, someone like myself, been in ministry a long time, obviously I'm not as intimidated if someone tries to challenge me on the issue, because I've been working in it and studying a long time. And, we go out at meetings and people come along and they bombard our speakers with questions as if we haven't heard them before. They've got their magic anti-creationist bullet argument. But the reality is we've most likely heard those things before. Now, not everyone is going to be able to have all that information, but guess what? They have access to it.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
They're not going to be able to store it up here. So someone comes along and asks you a question you can't answer, James, I'll tell you what, I'm not sure about the answer to that, but if you're interested, I can get it for you.
Yeah.
Give me a phone number and I'll text a link to you.
Yeah.
Or give me your email. Because I want to make the point here, it's not our job to save people. I can't save anybody. You can't save anybody.
No.
But that passage I read out, what it does ask us to do is to provide answers. Whether they get saved or not is God's problem. And I found that very liberating. That's why when somebody sits on a plane and challenges me, I'm just going to give them the information. I'm going to do it as graciously as I can. And sometimes they're not very gracious in their response because they're suddenly faced and being confronted with the situation. There might be a God.
Yeah.
But guess what? It's so liberating to understand that all I've got to do is obey that passage, and then it's over to God and the Holy Spirit as to, to the issue of their salvation. So I would encourage people, don't be intimidated. There is information, there are answers, and please start to work in your own family, start to ask questions of your own children, gauge where they're at in their faith, and think about the questions and the issues that they are going to face out in the world, and ask them, how would you address this? How would you answer this? Because I guarantee when you show them that there's information, as you just exemplified, it does something. Oh, wow, I never heard that before. That will energize and supercharge their faith. So in that light, James, because of that survey I did, it's called Fallout, by the way, and you're going to mention in a minute where people can get that. I wrote this, or co-wrote this booklet. It's called The Creation Survival Guide, and how to survive education with your faith intact. It's just a booklet. It's available on creation.com. And these are, if you like, it's a snapshot of the major questions that students are going to get. And it also helps them to prepare for the environment. And there's we originally produced it in a DVD, but it's available in streaming. So that's the survey I did on campuses. And it goes on a little bit more. So when students mention natural selection or fossils, we actually have one of our scientists talking about it, showing that there are answers and the problems with the evolutionary particular view. So, and as I said, we're making that free as a result of this podcast today.
So thanks, Gary. Yes, the documentary will be free. Link in the description. This is the first time ever that it's been free, so go check that out. Thanks so much, Gary, for being here and chatting with me today. It's been really insightful, and I think that this will be able to go out to tons of other people and they'll be able to hear it as well. Thanks so much, Gary, for joining us.
You're welcome.